I think this act of understanding the problem in a much more nuanced and specific way before jumping to solutionism, I think is really important. And so for me, I quite like actually the language of design thinking, just because it pushes this idea of empathy and staying with the problem a lot longer than the idea that design is about jumping into prototyping and developing some solution that you already magically held or had. Right. That's a practice that I would say is smart.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Dr. Geci Karuri-Sebina. Geci is a futurist, urban planning thinker, and the author of Innovation Africa, Emerging Hubs of Excellence. She's a faculty member at Singularity University South Africa, with a focus on urban futures, including smart cities, networks, urban planning, governance and development, and innovation systems. He's an associate of the South African Cities Network and had worked with the National Treasury, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa, and the University of California, Los Angeles Advanced Policy Institute. We spoke in early July 2022, and I was excited to talk to Geci because of her work on urban futures, smart cities, and smart governance. Gesci's also an associate of Dr. Bayo Komolafe, who was a guest of the podcast in episode 44. And it was really good to talk to Geci and absorb her approach to urban planning, smart city, and decolonizing. We talked about the value and importance of speaking your truth and how she learned that in childhood. Her journey from Kenya to the United States and then to South Africa. Her experiments with architecture, physics, computer science, why urban planning was more appealing to her than architecture, the issues that architecture doesn't address, her approach to foresight and futures thinking, smart cities and what constitutes bad urban design, her work with Dr. Bayo Komolafe, and decolonizing our knowledge and ways of knowing. I loved hearing about Geci's use of different foresight practices to imagine different futures and different possibilities for the future. But what really stayed with me is how dire the situation is, with urbanization outpacing our predictions and our ability to plan, and giving rise to shortages and unplanned solutions that may be less than ideal. We need every tool in our creative toolbox to make sure our cities grow to be a place of diversity, creativity, and opportunity, rather than their opposite. This episode is especially rich with resources and references, so I want to encourage everyone listening to check the show notes. We are fairly meticulous at listing and providing links to every article, book, person, or resource mentioned in the episode. We have close to a dozen weekly episodes already lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, and entrepreneurs who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Dr. Geci Karuri-Sebina. All right. I'm sitting here with Geci Karuri-Sebina. Geci, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you a lot.
All right. And so I'd love to start this conversation by connecting you with the world today and everything that's happening in it and everything that happened in the past couple of years, and ask you what it's like to be you these days in the world.
Wow, that's an opener. I think it feels a bit overwhelming. I think for anybody who's in the space of trying to do things, being involved in positions of whether it's leadership or, institutions that are meant to be doing something, I think it feels like a heavy burden to own and act in those spaces where so little is, feels certain, if it ever was, maybe less than ever. So I think that does feel like a heavy burden to bear. But I think in terms of where I am in my life right now, I think also in a way experiencing a bit of relief, feeling that I don't have to solve these things. And maybe I never could have. Yeah, combination of weight, but also sort of a bit of a light that says, just be careful what you understand of your role in that.
Yeah. I wish I could take some of that from you. I still struggle with the sense that I could do something and not quite being sure what it is. But I think one positive thing that came out of COVID in recent years is really, I think a lot of people are realigning their priorities. You know, we used to fly around the world to do projects, and we know now, unless it's absolutely necessary, we won't fly. You know, there was a big lull in pollution for a couple of years. Yeah. What's your, is there a realignment? Are you part of the Great Resignation or?
So oddly, I feel like COVID might have been like a highlight of a journey or some kind of spiral I was already going down. I feel like the Great Resignation had already began for me, quite literally. I'd literally walked away from my job about maybe a year and a half or two just before COVID really hit. And I was already in that space of pretty much having virtualized quite a bit of my life. Yes, traveling quite a lot, but actually being very aware of some of these contradictions about the things I was trying to do or the things I was talking about versus what my actions were showing or contributing to or legitimizing or reproducing. And so in a weird way, COVID was a place of good company for me, because what I found is many other people now with me in this weird little journey I was on. So I kind of felt like I was well on my way to my own personal lockdown and my own sense of these sort of existential questions and uncertainties.
I think we're going to get to that part, but to maybe start us on that journey, what's something that you've learned in childhood or early in life that is still present and alive in you today, still guides you or drives you today?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. For some reason, when people ask about my childhood, often my father, who passed away about a decade ago, and things he said to me often come to mind. And he said lots of sometimes deep things, sometimes strange things. One of them probably had to do with, he didn't use these words, but something to do with speaking your truth, that what people call opinionated, which I have been accused of being. You wouldn't hold an opinion if you didn't think it was true, so why not speak it? And I think that's something I've held, except I think in the way my father saw things. My father was not a very humble man. He kind of he'd had to fight for everything he had. And so he was very, very learned and very assured. I think I share maybe the learning in the sense that I've tried to be learned, but I'm far less certain of things than he was. But I think I've held that idea that it's worthwhile speaking your truth, even if you're not certain of it, and even if you might change your mind tomorrow. And I've really tried to do that, and I found it quite enriching because it evokes a response from the universe in some way. And in that response, I think often is the learning or the unlearning, how the question changes or how the idea changes, but that there's value in putting out that thing that you think or feel and owning that you feel or think that at the moment and not worrying too much about people thinking it's weird.
I connect with this on two levels. One is, as an Israeli, we're very opinionated, and we're part of a culture that's really encouraged. We're encouraged to speak up, speak our truth, and kind of reach the truth through argumentation. The other is design, where the word opinionated, it's one of those fields where the word opinionated is actually a positive thing. Right? You need to have an opinionated take on something. That means that you thought it through and you have something to show for the thinking.
I didn't know that about the design. That's really interesting. On the first, it's really interesting because I grew up in a house where my father made us debate all the time. And he'd always say, ultimately, I'll make the decision. I'm the head of this house. But I encourage you to feel free to present your positions and to argue your views. And we grew up from a very early age having to do that. And there are issues with it, of course. I think we don't live in a world where everybody thinks or does things that way. And sometimes it can create distance, actually, with people who are conflict averse or people who see that as somehow confrontational. And I faced that even in my personal relationships quite a bit, that I've had to recognize that even though I have a high appetite for debate and argument, not everybody does and not everybody is comfortable with it. Yep. So that's always been
Oh.
tricky.
And so you were born in Kenya, right? And then moved to the US.
That's
And
right.
then you sketched this really nice arc for me through Iowa and LA. And then today you're in South Africa. So tell me about that journey.
Yeah. So born and raised in Kenya, and so my folks were there and everything. And when I was 17, there was lots of unrest in Kenya, and the universities basically would shut down, and they kind of still do every time there was any kind of political, a sort of noise. The first thing they'd do, because the varsity students would be very politicized and take to the streets, so they'd close down the university, and so. My parents were a bit anxious that my sister, who was 2 years ahead of me, had been out of school mostly for those 2 years, just had gotten a job literally and wasn't in school. So my father was part of the kind of just post-colonial generation of professionals who'd been taken around the world, and he'd happened to be in the US. And so his brothers actually had settled and never come back. So we had this family constellation that was around Ohio, actually, in the US, sort of in the Midwest. And so I just very randomly found a school in Iowa, which I'd never heard of and nobody I knew had ever heard of. But that kind of felt like, okay, if that's who's accepted me, that's where I'm going. And that's where I went. So I went to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Where I initially went actually to study architecture, which also was a little bit randomly chosen, I think, from a TV show, actually. So got into a sort of a liberal arts college to study architecture, found that what they offered really was pre-architecture, and then you had to go into a full architecture program. But you could fulfill the requirements of pre-architecture and then later do the architecture. So I chose to go that route. And that was exciting because I found I had a real passion for physics, actually, and in really quite technical things. It ended up translating into a computer science major because my father couldn't stomach me being a physics major. He was like, what are you going to do with a physics major? You're going to be a teacher. Whereas computer science sounded like something useful, I guess, at the time. Just when I began my first internship and was beginning to realize there's something about this space that I enjoyed technically, but I struggled with contextually. I struggled to see how it related to the life I knew growing up in Kenya, in the sense that it didn't seem to address issues beyond the organization. And, I was working in a company where we were scanning barcodes, and that was technically very exciting. But what does that got to do with anything? I also want to play a role in this bigger societal thing that I'm seeing and really development issues. And so through a sort of serendipitous encounter, found out about sociology and ended up doing a second major in sociology. And I think in my life, I see many of those junctures where just serendipitous engagements, the path splits or a new path gets shown. And so ended up doing the two of those together, then still applied to architecture school. And that and the horrible climate of the Midwest is what took me to LA, because it was really about getting a good architecture school, but also getting out of winter. Because coming from Kenya, it was horrible. I just remember enjoying the first 10 minutes of snow and then hating the rest
10 minutes is about enough.
Yeah, it was enough. Yeah, so that was the trip to LA, architecture school. Midway through that, again, I started developing a concern that I loved the aesthetic of design. I loved the language of design. I loved spatiality. But again, I was missing this piece that said, but even if I work at the level of a building, what does that have to do with these other things that are still bothering me, and they're not comfortably finding a place. And the program was also quite particular. They weren't concerned with those issues. And so there's a bit of a journey there to finding out about the world of urban planning and finding out that, the combination of the two actually did begin to pick up on issues.
You mentioned these issues that weren't present in architecture and that were missing. So help me understand what these were.
If you grow up as a kid, I would say maybe anywhere, but I can only speak to my own experience. If you grew up as a kid in Nairobi and you grew up seeing urban life, rural life, you grew up seeing poverty and affluence, and me being able to go to the US because the school was shut down, these were really minority experiences, seriously minority experiences. And I think I'd probably always been very acutely bothered by a lot of what I saw around me and not wanting to be comfortable with the idea that this was normal, because I didn't think things had to be like this. I'd like to call it empathy. I think it was a deep empathy with a lot of what I saw, but it's also what I was experiencing, because poverty wasn't separate from me. I mean, I didn't grow up poor, but I grew up with poverty all around me, including in my family. So it may not have been me, but it was everybody who looked like me. So I didn't feel separate from these issues. So I think I would struggle with the idea of going into a program that would, for example, in architecture, I'd be given a design project and I'd say, okay, this is really great. We can work on this, but could we just talk about the economics of this project, and can we talk about what it's going to do to these other communities who probably won't be able to engage with it in the way we're talking about? And I'd always be made to feel as though those weren't important questions to worry about, that I was worrying about too many things. Or interestingly, here's a funny one. This would have been in the early 90s. I would also raise issues around environmental issues. So I'd be concerned about, but like the impact of this building. And weirdly, it's hard. I'm sure people would deny it now, but honestly, I was told those things didn't matter. People were not concerned about the carbon footprint of buildings, and they were not concerned that we knew of indigenous ways to do this better. In fact, they didn't care about indigenous ways or any other ways, any alternatives. So I just felt like I was always bringing up the wrong stuff. It's like I was a bad-mannered student. And, it's a bit like, even now, I experience here in South Africa, sometimes I speak sometimes to architecture students, and it always happens in the class that somebody, usually a student of color, and it's kind of sad that happens, raises some issue about the community or about poverty or about gender or about whatever. And you can almost hear the groan in the class, oh, here we go again, the eyes rolling back, you keep bringing up this stuff. And I felt like that. I was that student who felt that, and I do great in the technical classes and the theoretical work, but it was in the studios is where it always came up, because there was this sense that I keep bringing up things that this isn't about. And I couldn't understand how this could not be about that.
Yeah. Well, you were maybe a little ahead of your time, because now that you did it before it was cool. So I want to bring this to foresight and future thinking, because I think a lot of it ends up leading you there. And so what was your journey into this world of futurism, foresight, future literacy, I think you call it? So I would love to see how it connects.
Yeah. So when I moved to South Africa, I was working at a science council. I was brought in specifically to do a lot of strategic planning work around big infrastructure domains. And so it was about systems and how we could do long-range strategic thinking. But fairly early in my time there, I think just the second year in, an Africa-wide program called NEPAD, it was the New Partnership for Africa's Development, started up. And it was a couple of African presidents running this. And it was really this big, bold vision for how Africa was going to not carry the begging bowl anymore, and we were going to do it ourselves and this sort of thing. And what I was asked to do was to lead for Southern Africa an infrastructure team that was going to think about the big regional infrastructure issues. So, transport, telecommunications, energy, water, so those big systems, and how we were going to think about regional cooperation, regional coordination around some of these big infrastructure and infrastructure backlog issues. Now, just beginning into that work, one thing I quickly realized, is that the tools one learns in urban planning, its time horizons, its ability to engage with complexity in terms of the tools I had just weren't going to cut it. I wasn't able to think and work at that scale of the whole of Southern Africa, all of the dimensions of politics and society and technical issues. There were just too many things. Right. And the timescales would be too long. This wasn't anymore about talking about 5-year plans. You're talking about 50, 100-year plans. And I didn't have the tools to do that. And this is where the futures and foresight came in. So some of them were fairly technical tools, like think tools, and how you could really do these sort of quantitative modeling exercises that allowed you to think about drivers and change and all of that. Some of them were more scenario planning, and how could you do pestle analyses, and how could you really look at some complex systems issues in a sort of systematic way. And for a number of years, I then sort of got quite involved through the Millennium Project, actually, into creating a Southern Africa node and beginning to organize around this. We called it this idea of creating a culture of futures thinking.
Can you give me an example of what is the process like that? What does it look like? Something that, is really exciting as a way of starting to think about the future.
It's interesting because with every exercise, there's, first of all, an epiphany bit where one begins to realize that, even if it's something as simple as scenario planning, you realize that, but there isn't a singular idea of the future, I can actually play with how I see the future and different considerations, and they paint different pictures. And I can begin to think about whether they're futures I desire. I could begin thinking about in a fairly safe way, what would it look like to find myself in futures I don't like? Almost in the way we do with movies. You kind of watch sci-fi and you like it or you don't, but I guess you're sitting on your couch. You can comfortably indulge in this. But to be able to do that in a way that includes yourself. So there's quite a lot about personal sort of futures and personal foresight that people don't always do. I would argue that we all do it in some way. When you're buying a pension scheme product or when you're buying an education policy or something like that, you are obviously thinking about the future because you're investing in something quite futuristic. But I think we don't tend to think about the whole future, and that in fact there are various ways we can play with, think about them. There are ways we can exert influence on it. And so we did it institutionally mainly. So we did these scenarios for Southern Africa, and we painted some pretty cool scenarios about what it might look like to have a Rift Valley future if half the region continued to develop at a rapid pace while others were left behind. And we visualized that and began talking about essentially, literally a valley where you've got these two different things happening. But what could it look like to also have a future that didn't look like that? And what would be the drivers or the triggers that would fill in that valley and create more connection than separation without necessarily it being, okay, so slow down the people who are developing or just pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, those of you who are behind, because those are the kind of very flippant things we tend to think about. But how could you really in a much more textual way think about change and think about the characteristics of something you might prefer. So those sorts of things, that's the kind of thing we were doing. On the personal futures, we worked with high schools and did something called the Global Millennium Prize with high schools in South Africa. That was very cool because when you get young people, I think it's not just that they have more hope, but there's a lot more openness to imagining even things that I suppose a more experienced person might say that's crazy or that's impossible. They don't have that fear yet. They don't know what they don't know, and they're not constrained by what they know because what they know changes every day. But it's only in recent years I really began to rethink the level of determinism that kind of futuring held. And for me, it doesn't remove the value of that kind of work, but it did begin to question, how are we using the future and how and why are we doing that? And what are we leaving out? And what are the assumptions that we might hold that occlude different possibilities? And that's what futures literacy and Riel Miller's work from UNESCO has been a lot about that, about saying there is a difference between what he calls anticipation for the future, meaning you're thinking about the future because you want to do something about the future or for the future, and what he calls anticipation for emergence, which means an appreciation that actually you don't know anything about the future and you'll never know anything about the future. And so you've got to be quite reflective about what you're doing and understand your only agency is in the now. And it's important that you don't make it impossible for yourself to be imaginative and responsible in the now because you're busy obsessing in the future. So it's a really important for me cautionary, but also emancipatory way of thinking about how we think about the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when I spoke to Eddie Obeng, he's a professor who talks about the pace of change and how we cross the point where we can actually learn and plan fast enough to catch up with the change. And what does that mean for anyone working on trying to make a 50-year or 100-year plan? Like, can you make a 50 or 100-year plan for a city or for... So, what are some practices that you find work in this new environment? Like you called it emerging. So we're a group of people trying to think about the future, let's say, or the future of cities, and we sit together. What can we do that's actually useful in a situation like that?
So that's a great question, because coming from the discipline of planning where I did, it was all about the plan, right? So the blueprint, it was the idea that you use whatever evidence you can, and we talk a lot about evidence in the policy space as well, that you could use to make the best possible plan. And then we learn, of course, over time but your plan may not be perfect because, as you said, things may change. And then you go into what we then call contingency. So you've got a plan and you've got a plan B and C and D for what you do with it. I think what futures literacy does is to get you to understand that's a good practice. It's better to have a plan than none, but also to understand and to be much more humble about your ability to predict and control all of the conditions that would make your plan relevant. I mean, COVID's a great example. How many plans did COVID just kick out the window, right? And so we use these terms like future proofing, which I don't really like at all, because it is that idea that we think we can somehow control for everything we can think about. Now, what my emerging practice and what futures literacy would suggest is that you're far better understanding that if you could gain an appreciation that there are things that are emergent, there are things that you don't control about the future, your question then legitimately becomes, or well, wisely becomes, much more about yourself and what capabilities, what is the behavior you need to have to survive in many possible futures, all of which you can't predict. And then you get to really interesting things because you begin maybe coming up with words like empathy, words like flexibility, words like adaptability, words like friendship,
So bringing it into the world of cities, so you're famous for talking about smart cities, and you're probably tired of that whole term, but I remember seeing the slides that you showed in one of those conferences about this rapid growth in population, exponential growth in population, increasing urbanization, and how the plans just are not catching up with the reality, right? The informal becomes the de facto plan because the plans don't catch up. So what do you recommend in the city space? How do we apply these values, these cultural values, or that you identified, or what's the right way to go about it, given that the pace is not going to slow down, it's only going to speed up?
There's not really an easy answer to some of these things, but what I currently, or what I think I advocate for, is a much more appreciative form of practice. One of the things we tend to do, again, as formal organizations, and Paul Jenkins has done some interesting writing on this, understanding what makes the formal, right? And really beginning to question it, because what it really is an elite consensus about what is acceptable and right, and that anything that doesn't fit within that, which really suits rather few people, anything outside of that is then deemed informal. And so I think I advocate for an appreciative practice that doesn't begin by judging what is informal as bad or unacceptable, but recognizing that if that's the dominant practice, there's a reason for that, and there's something we've got to learn about that. And if there are things that we have to qualify who we is, don't like about that, then there's got to be some way to work into it, to work with it, not to obsess, as we have, I think, for too many years in Africa, obsess about how we can eradicate it. And we use words like that, or how we can formalize it, whatever number of, kind of exclusionary terms we use about how to deal with the majority of what's happening around us. There's got to be a different way of engaging with it. And because we're so obsessed with formalization and forms that we've seen somewhere, those become the smart city. And I really don't think that's very smart at all. And so I think an appreciative practice is what I would speak to. And I think a much more adventurous spirit. I think we've got to invite the possibility that our cities look like something we could never have imagined. And I think that's a scary thought, because everybody thinks we're trying to recreate New York or something. And I'm sure many New Yorkers would wonder why anybody would do that. And Riel Miller also often warns, and this is the humility part, that going this route may not necessarily look better. It might be a complete mess, but we're in a complete mess now. We're in a complete mess of trying to panel beat something in a way that's not working, that's not generative, that's not creating any possibility of anything different.
That sparks a few thoughts. First of all, you wrote about smart cities, that they're a bit of a buzzword. I'm quoting from your writing. The shiny, pristine, one-size-fits-all alien city of steel and glass, greenways and waterways, and easily parachutes in from the north with great clarity. And then you contrast that, I think, with the things that are actually emerging on the ground, and the existing practices and the local cultures, and things that could actually be closer to what the future of those cities could be. And then the other thing that just came up as you were speaking is a law of engineering that I read recently, Gall's Law, which basically says complex systems that work evolve from simple systems that work. That's the only way for complex systems to actually be designed correctly. is to start with the simple and iterate on them. And are we at the point where, hey, we have something that works here on a small scale. How can we help it grow, as opposed to this massive plan that's very top down? Yeah. What does that start in your, or what's your response to that?
So there's some pretty cool work that's been done out of Cape Town, out of Stellenbosch University. You might have seen it. I think they called it Seeds of the Anthropocene. And there's elements of that work that I quite like because it uses this language of seeds to describe, I think, what you were just speaking on just now. This idea that they are emerging, we might call them pilots or demonstrators or practices that are low res. They're not yet the way things are done, but they begin to signal different possibility, right? They're experiments or they're in situ practices somewhere, and that there's something one could learn out of that. They possibly signal different future possibilities. And that actually quite excites me. And so I really do buy into that. And the second thing is, how can we create the space for much more of that kind of experimentation? I worked, like I said, in a science council. I don't know if the figures have changed, but when I worked there, the success rate in terms of what came out of R&D that actually went into innovation and got commercialized, it was 4%. And apparently 4% was a good enough number for us to invest lifetimes, in doing R&D. But we don't do that with the policy space. We don't do that with society. We are not comfortable with the idea that actually 96% may just require trying things, and a few of them will work and many of them won't. But that's okay, because that's the only way we'll find out what works. We have this pressure to find these silver bullets, to find these unicorns that require such certainty, that requires these big bets, and we can all put our money on that horse and we can all win. It's a bit crazy.
Yeah.
It's a bit crazy.
And it's really interesting because in the startup world, in the VC world and the venture funding world, there's this term, the power law. And the power law says that essentially maybe only 1 out of 30 or even 1 out of 100 will actually take off in a big way and change the world. But the cost of doing it is very worth it, because that one that transforms returns more than you put in all the others combined. And I would think that in public policy, there's a place for something like that as well. But of course, there's also this risk averseness because it's public funds, and so you have to solve for that.
Yeah, but then I think also we have to solve for that, but we also have to acknowledge the folly of making those big bets and failing so horribly as we often do. So to me, the cumulative benefit of trying many small things and only having a few of them succeed, but the learning you get to do by everything else, that sounds to me like a not too bad an investment. But the idea that we believe that one big thing is what we want, and then we invest all our resources in this one big thing, excluding everything else, and then that one big thing doesn't work, and many of these big things don't work. That to me is a much crazier and a much less worthwhile investment than that diffuse thing. But I think you might be right. The politics and the way these things get sold, the elections, as you promise these big things, I guess society doesn't want to be told, or at least we think society doesn't want to be told, that actually we don't know what we're doing. We're going to just try a lot of stuff. But guess what? We'll include you in trying a lot of this stuff. And then we'll come. I think society could take that. But I guess politically, it's not been seen to be a very saleable proposition. We've got these very cowboy politics that I find quite bizarre.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. And so help me understand what good looks like. That's a common design phrase. Or what does good look like? So it doesn't have to be one thing, but give me some of the taste of things that you think are a good direction. For when we're talking about cities, what are some experiments? What are some programs that are inspiring?
So I'm a big fan of very situated work. So for me, good looks like, and I know you are in the world of makers and tinkerers as well. I think that's really good. I think the idea that anybody feels inspired and permitted and encouraged to actually try and sort out things and to expand their own capabilities to try things. I think that's really good because I think that's the real definition of empowerment and education. I think good is relevance to context. One of the forms of architecture I like the least are the ones that seem like somebody in an ill-fitting suit. Like you're really wondering, like it clearly doesn't work and probably nobody really thinks it's very good, but for some reason, this person felt the need to wear this suit. And that's often a shiny building in a context where that doesn't work. It's a path put in a plane. We've seen many of these images, where there's a sort of a paved path and then there's the dusty one where people actually walk. And I think there's so many examples of other things that work exactly like that. So you can clearly see the practice and what people do around here is not what has been provisioned for. So there's an inappropriateness, there's a lack of just awareness, self-awareness in what's being done. And it makes you wonder who's doing that thing that doesn't understand that that's not how things work around here.
Yeah. And that's actually in the world of product design, we're encouraged to look at unexpected forms of usage and what users are doing that's unexpected, because that's often the best indicator for what they actually want. That's different from what you're providing. And taking that and embracing that is such an important part of product design.
Yeah. But do you find a resistance to that? Because I know in my space, I have so many examples of the resistance to that recognition that somebody's not using the thing. So it feels like a failure of the user as opposed to an opportunity for the design or a failure of the design. Do you find people accept that message?
I think when it comes to digital products, it's a pretty commonly seen as an opportunity rather than as something negative, because that's often an idea for a new feature. Sometimes you can even monetize it, right? There's more of an incentive there to react positively to that, I think. So I'd like to maybe try to look at a few, and I know that you may have been doing that so much that it's boring to you, but I do think for people who don't know smart cities and don't know what they're about and don't know what the potential could even be, I'd love to have just a little bit of a side-by-side of where we are today and what are some practices out there, programs that we can be inspired by.
I guess part of the idea of the smart city is good in that there's a lot of maybe dysfunction in the current city that could be made better, and whether it's better through technology, and we have better ways of using data, better ways of using technology to make things more efficient. I'm all for that. I think that's a good idea. I think we want to create spaces that are more comfortable for people and to use the data to understand that. I think we want to create tools and systems that make it easier for people to get from A to B or to use a service that they're meant to be able to use. The question for me, and I think a question we always have to ask ourselves, is in the first place, what's the issue here? So what's the question before we jump to the answer? And I think that's the challenge of the smart city, right? The smart city is an answer. And whereas, as I just painted, the problem may broadly be known and true, that maybe we've got spaces that could work better. That's very vague. So there's a need to get a lot more specific and a lot more contextual about what really are the questions here. Because if you fail to do that, the risk is that you focus then on optimizing or making more efficient something that's highly problematic. I often use the example, I need to find a few more examples, but I often use the example of using blockchain to make more efficient property administration systems, whereas in contexts like ours, the property markets work in such exclusionary and problematic ways that I can't imagine why somebody would think that the problem in the first place is to make it more efficient. Yeah. I think it needs to be dismantled. And so I think this act of understanding the problem in a much more nuanced and specific way before jumping to solutionism, I think is really important. And so for me, I quite like actually the language of design thinking, just because it pushes this idea of empathy and staying with the problem a lot longer than the idea that design is about jumping into prototyping and developing some solution that you already magically held or had.
Right.
That's a practice that I would say is smart. I think it's also smart to think about approaches to cities or to anything else that really empower and enhance the agency of communities. Now, that's what matters to me, but I think it's what matters to a lot of people. I think for all of us, we're kind of communal animals. I think it's really useful and important for us to think not just about how to save the world, which we seem to spend a lot of time thinking about, but how to actually contribute positively to the agency and the capacity and the power and the freedom of everybody around us to do better for themselves. For me, it's that kind of stuff. And I do worry sometimes that maybe I've begun to sound a lot more abstract than I sounded 10 years ago, where I was very clear about my diagnosis on things. But maybe it's just where I am right now, is that I find that the need is less to prescribe and more to encourage people just to think. I was in a PhD academy last week, and it was really funny because I gave a presentation they really weren't expecting. Because you go to these academies and everybody kind of tells you how to do things, right? So this is how you do these methods, and this is how you do that thing. And I kind of did something that was a lot more philosophical, but I felt it was appropriate because that's what a PhD is. And the conversations after were really cool because people were like, it's so funny because nobody reminds us that the most important thing we need to do here is to think.
Yeah.
We don't use those words anymore. We don't talk about just thinking.
No, it's funny. You said you're becoming more philosophical, and I was thinking, I think Bai will do that to you. That's the way that he deconstructs everything. When we talked and he started problematizing hope for me, I was like, okay, I thought if there was anything that's still definitely positive, it would be hope. But
yeah, he messes everything up.
So. What is, and we'll get to bio in a second, but what is C2D, capacity to decolonize?
Oh.
What does that mean?
So yeah, that's a good one. So C2D is a project that a few people, we got together and we were interested. In fact, it came out of a funding call. So there was a funding call that was actually out there to talk about how the humanities in education may need to be rethought to be more robust for the future and this kind of thing. And a few of us got together, and the initial idea was, how do we get the academy to engage with these ideas of futures literacy, to be less deterministic, less containered, and a little bit more evolved, if you want, in how they... And it's very difficult because in the academy, things are very boxed. The disciplines are king, hierarchy is rigid, the ways of knowing are very positivist and modernist, very structured. And so what we think we know is what we've allowed ourselves to know, and the ways in which we valorize knowledge has also itself been constrained. And so just to be able to combat those things, when we talk about decolonizing education or decolonizing our thinking, there are really deep questions there that are very difficult for the academy to engage with because it's so steeped in particular traditions and particular legitimacies that hold it. So we came up with this idea that the most important thing would be to think about how do you actually decolonize, and what's the role of futures literacy actually as an essential capability to doing that? So your ability to understand your anticipatory systems and how you engage with the world and how you engage with the future becomes a very important capability to have if you're going to imagine anything different about the academy or anything different about your community even. So we did this very participatory project, and it was meant to be very sort of co-designy, and we managed to pull off essentially about a half-year process working with this community of 30 people around the world, mainly from the global south, but also from the north, really having very deep co-design conversations about what it would look like to develop the capacity to decolonize. And it was really fun, really deep. We came up with ideas that very much pointed, and I was quite happy about this, to the need for learning by doing. So it wasn't about coming up with a new theory of how we could do this. It was going to be about processes. It was going to be about and we used the metaphor, you don't grow a forest by blueprinting it, right? Forests can be very effective and full of life, but they don't have to be on a grid and they can grow in different ways. But there's certain agents, and we used that as a metaphor for how, if we wanted to talk about these decolonial projects, how they could pan out. And we suggested beginning to explore around 3 sectors that we chose, and it would be case-based, and the cases would be very iterative and increase over time. So it's a beautiful idea. The idea is still there. And every time we talk about it and we share it with people, there's a very positive response, including from my own university. But in the last year or so, since we've completed that project, we've battled to really get anybody to sign off on a check to say, go do the pilots. And I kind of understand why, because inevitably we've gone to the typical philanthropies to say, okay, will you fund this really bold experimentation? But guess what? We can't tell you what the metrics are. We can't tell you what the outcomes will be. We don't even know exactly who the participants will be, because that might change over time, but we can tell you who the custodians, at least, who are holding it is. But yeah, it's been hard to, you come up with these really loopy projects, and then you find the institutions don't really have a high tolerance threshold for things they don't understand.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true. And then you find out that if you want to start your own institution, then you still need to convince people to join, and people don't join things that they don't understand, and then you have to. I think that's like a multi-layer challenge, and eventually people do things that they understand on some level, or that there's a maturity that people go through. I encounter a lot of projects that are really ultimately about a new way of seeing the world, or a new way of engaging with the world. And my recommendation is usually in these situations is start a podcast, because you need to get people to tune in and listen to you and become interested in what you have to say before you can do anything massive about it, right? So it's a great way to start connecting people and reaching out to people. And there's a movement forward. It's just it's not measured in dollars or in impact, but at first it's just measured in people who are tuning in to listen. And at some point you can inflect it into the actual change that you're trying to bring about, which I would love to listen to to the Capacity to Decolonize podcast. That would be
lovely. Let's do it.
I mean, you have a subscriber for now, and if you need any help on the podcasting side, we can talk.
I love it. It's a deal. I'll take you up on that. I really will, because we do want to see that move
wonderful.
forward.
So you've been working with Bio for some time now, and you've also had a shared project with him. I'd love to hear about your association and anything that came out of it.
Yeah. So met Bio quite, again, serendipitously. I think it must have been around 2018 or maybe 2018, 2017. We were organizing with UNESCO a conference on, I think it was called Transforming Africa's Future or something like this. But it was a convening we were doing actually here in Johannesburg. And we were just looking for voices that could animate the space. And one of the organizers said, you've got to listen to this poet/writer from Nigeria, and his name is Bayo Kamolafe, and he'd be great for this. And just so much resonance, and it's like a sibling who I met for the first time, because we really clicked and began having conversations. So one of the other things we're doing right now, and I hope we'll finish it, maybe by saying it to you, I'll maybe manifest it, as my daughter says. We are writing an article about cancel culture. And I'm really enjoying it, because we're really exploring this whole idea of what that means sort of as people, and these things we do and we play into, and that really bother both he and I, sort of just finding a conversation space to talk about it and to question ourselves, and to invite people to question themselves too, about what these things really mean when we talk about harm, and when we talk about silencing people, and when we talk about these judgments that we've become very quick and very harsh about. How we make sense of that for ourselves, and what does it do to us, the cancelers, as well, once we get sucked into this cancel culture. And so I'm really quite enjoying just writing with him and working with him in those sorts of ways. And it's not easy, but it's generative and it's exciting.
Yeah, I would not want to write with Bayo. He's I mean, he writes beautifully, but I'm not sure that, it would be a challenge for sure.
We're also so different because, I'm like this planner. I come from this very, and he's he comes from a psychology background, and he's like super philosopher of note. As abstractly as I speak, sometimes I'm actually really quite a practical person, and I've learned to have to get things done, and so I kind of very easily go into that. And so it's so funny to work with him because we work in very different ways. But yeah, I'm very open to the crazy experience of trying to write with him.
I'd love to read that. That would be exciting. He spoke a little bit about cancel culture when we spoke, and I think he had a lot of really interesting things to say. I'd love to see how you flesh it out and make it into something that I really do think we need to hear that. I really do think, because there's two wrong directions that are now playing out in the culture, which is either cancel culture is terrible and we shouldn't care about harm at all, or it's the way to go and we should cancel everybody. I mean, clearly they're both wrong, but just putting your finger on it is so tough.
Yeah.
So I have a final question for you. This is our traditional closing question. In his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being a modern way of delivering information, and it's usually pretty dry, and then you make up your own mind. And a sermon is a passionate plea to change someone's life. And he would like to hear more sermons in this world, and so will I. And so I know that you are in a place of questioning also, but if you had a chance to give a short sermon, what would it be about?
Wow. First of all, thank you for defining these two terms, because I'm going to be a lot more careful about whether I'm lecturing or giving sermons in future. Okay, if I could give a sermon about something, and I'm going to talk about this within my context. So I'm in Africa and a lot of my work is here because that's kind of where I am. So that's the context often that I'm concerned with. I think it would be a sermon about how we could do whatever we are trying to do. I don't want to say differently, but we could do it in more open and meaningful ways than what we're trying to do right now. I really feel like we're on a broken record trying to replay something that's scratched, and we could actually just get off that. And, that whole language of finding a seat at the table and trying to arrive and catch up, the language of catch up with the rest of the world, the leapfrogging so that we can get where everybody else is. But just to completely jump out of that paradigm and in a way have the permission to be who we are and to explore and find things that feel good, that make sense, that may be different. I would literally give a sermon about, I want to use the word decolonizing, but of course itself can be quite a problematic term. But just freedom, that freedom to just be different, try something else, to imagine possibility outside of what we've seen, what we think we know, what we've been told. For me, it would be in these spaces like smart cities, like with officials that are having to make decisions and what they think are the parameters of decision making. I would love to be able to give a sermon about that, and it couldn't be a lecture because I wouldn't have any definitive information to offer. But I'd love to convince people that we have the permission to try something.
That's amazing. Thank you very much, Geci. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Aaron. I really enjoyed this, and I look forward to exploring our podcast.
Same here. Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.